everybody. Welcome to Naturalistics, a podcast dedicated to helping you become a better naturalist. My name is Stefan, and here with me is Matt.
What is up?
This month on the podcast, we are happy to be bringing you our first interview with
Kaija Klauder of Alaska.
And before we roll into our interview, Matt, would you like to say a few words?
I will say a few words. All right, so you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, other things probably too. You can email us at naturalisticspod@gmail.com, and we want to just give a shout out to all the people who've been getting in touch and telling us, giving us feedback and telling us how much they enjoy the podcast. Please share, like, subscribe, spread the word. Tell people about us. The more people that listen, the better. It's getting bigger and bigger every episode, and we thank you for your support and help. So like, share, subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. Oh yeah, and write us a review on iTunes. We only have a few reviews on iTunes, so if you like the podcast, but only if you like the podcast, please write us a review. So with that, we're going to head over to the interview, and we'll see you over there.
Thanks for listening.
Do I introduce her? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say you're more qualified than I am.
Okay. All right, so we've got our first interview of all time with Kaija Klauder of Alaska in Seattle, calling in, Skyping in. It's good to have you, Kaija.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks.
for making the time to come on our podcast.
Yeah, welcome.
Oh, thanks. I'm stoked to be here. I think this will be really fun.
Cool. Yeah, and I went to school with Kaija at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, and that's where we did some research projects together and got to learn how much of a good naturalist Kaija is and an amazing tracker and all those things. And now she's doing wolf research for her master's program and many other things as well. So we'll just we'll kick it off.
Yeah. So one of the things we wonder about with talking to different naturalists and getting different people's perspectives, and one thing we keep coming back to is their stories. And we'd like to ask you where your naturalist story begins. If there's like something that you see as a pivotal moment, maybe in your youth or somewhere where you realize that you were going down this road.
Oh, I wish that I had a really great particular story for that, but really my perception is much more that it's kind of just always been part of who I am. So I guess from birth. So I wish that I had a really nice story that I could sort of answer this question with, but in my case, I actually feel like it's much more been just something that's been with me since birth. I have always been totally fascinated by the natural world. I also give my parents and family a lot of credit for fostering that. So, I don't know if my life had been different, would I have pursued this path? I can't say, but it's something that my parents, especially my dad, really modeled for me whenever we were outside, which was a lot, I've never heard this bird here before. Like, wonder what it's doing here. And then like next week, oh, here's that bird again. So just a lot of that sort of fostering that kind of awareness and interest in me. I have a memory of, I was probably like 5 or 6 years old. It was wintertime, and I was hanging out in my parents' house is on like an acre and a half. So it's not very big, but there's like woods around the house, and I would just play there all the time. And it had been sort of windy and the snow had gotten a crust on it. And I found some tracks, and I didn't know what they were. And I thought it would be maybe not so likely that either of my parents would actually like come to the track to help me. But I realized that because of the crust on the snow, I could essentially just like with my finger, like saw out around one of the tracks. And then I had it like on this wafer of snow, and I carried it to my dad, and I said, "What is this?" And he said, "Oh, I think that's a house cat." And he like pointed out why, and it was just like I felt so accomplished in like I did this thing and I learned this thing.
Yes, that's a cool story.
And I basically feel like I am still doing the same thing like 30 years later.
Here's a wolf track.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Pretty much.
So, that story is like could happen to somebody anywhere, really, like anywhere there's snow, I guess. But
sure.
But I guess the next question was like, so what was it like growing up in Alaska as a kid, like, and that in relation to your developing as a naturalist, you know, at an early age?
Frankly, it was kind of paradise.
Yeah.
I really loved Alaska. There is, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that it's very accurate to sort of say that like one place has more nature than another place in general, like maybe compared to like Manhattan or something. I don't know. But certainly Alaska has so much space that is not at all managed for human desires.
Yeah.
And it's very, I mean, not even like, oh, there's big national park, but like literally my yard, you know, as soon as I stepped off of the driveway, I was in a space that was like no longer really being managed for human desires. Mm-hmm. And I think I found that really valuable in terms of being able to see and to a certain extent sort of participate, at least in a tangible way, in natural processes that were totally just kind of doing their own thing and that were unmediated by some kind of human plan, the way even something like a national park can be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The other thing I think that growing up in Alaska really, a way that it really shaped me, and both as a person and I also think as a naturalist, is I grew up in a framework where landscape that was not being managed for human use was the norm. That was the background. That was the baseline. That was the reference category. And that's a very different perspective than most people get growing up in this country. Yeah. And it wasn't until much later that I really realized that that was the case. But I think that not only is it just good to have different perspectives like that on land management, but I think that it gave me a certain sense of hope, maybe, because I didn't have this sort of automatic feeling of the world is all used up.
Yeah. I have a question, just like follow up. So do you think animals, let's just take animals, but do you think these animals like act differently, behave differently in human spaces versus wilderness spaces? Do you think that gives you perspective just as like an animal behaviorist or a tracker or in that kind of way?
Well, I think it's a question of degree, not of kind.
Yeah. I
mean, if we're talking about a city park versus some remote wilderness, of course, but there's a lot of scale in between.
Right.
I guess maybe in the sense that when I would encounter animals or I would encounter the sign of animals, it was not generally my assumption that whatever they were doing had to do with me or with humans in general, because there was really no reason for that to be true in most cases. That being said, I think animals are able to maintain a lot of that kind of behavioral autonomy, even under circumstances that we start to see as somewhat more managed. So, I wouldn't say that I had any kind of particularly special privilege there that you really couldn't get anywhere else.
Gives me
that
hope
makes sense.
For my suburban lifestyle.
I guess with the caveat that, like, in terms of what the science says is that, like, animals do tend to change their behaviors if they're living in increasingly human impacted landscapes.
Okay, one more question. I didn't really think about this before, but I just recently got back from Africa, and it was just so cool to be in spaces where, you could be killed by something. Like, there literally, like, could be a leopard, like, right there, and you wouldn't see it, and that would just be the end. And that just totally changes the dynamic, right, of walking around the forest, walking around landscapes. And that's true in Alaska. I mean, almost certainly during the summer when there's bears out and stuff like that. Can you speak to that at all, like growing up in a place like that?
Yeah, I think from the wildlife perspective, that is true to a certain degree in terms of bears and stuff. Although, and maybe this is just what I'm used to, I actually find places that have a lot of like small venomous animals to be infinitely more terrifying.
Nice,
like bears are really big, and like when they run at you, you can see them.
Yeah.
Like you know what's happening when a bear is attacking you. But like, I don't know, if some weird little spider or something bites you, you'll just like die and don't even know. Anyway.
Keel over. You turn into a zombie.
Yeah, right. But I think one thing that it did and I think you spoke to this well, the quality of a landscape does, or at least the quality of our experience of a landscape does change depending on kind of what we know is out there. And one thing that was made pretty clear to me from a young age, not in a frightening way, but just in a way of this is reality, is that there is this like absolutely colossal indifference of the landscape to humans. And a lot of people feel that as not as an indifference, but actually as an attack. Like oh, this
fearful,
like this land is out to get me. And the reality is it's not. It like literally does not know you exist and therefore cannot give any shits about your survival.
Yeah.
And like carrying an awareness of that all the time gives you a lot of respect for a place.
Yeah.
You know, if there is no assumption of like, oh, like, you know, basically I could easily die. No one would like the tree, like nothing around me would really care. Like this wouldn't be a big problem. It would just happen.
Yeah.
And when I went to New England, I remember walking around in the forests there, you know, where there are no large carnivores. The weather was much more temperate. And I was just like, it was kind of the reverse, but I was like, God, it feels so friendly here.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, that's kind of silly because it's still just a landscape and it doesn't even know I exist. But
yeah, no, it's like feels like warm and fuzzy or something.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Bears are kind of warm and fuzzy, but they're just too warm and fuzzy or something.
We're interested in your research and what is the current focus of your research? What are you learning about? What are you curious about professionally right now?
Sure. Well, I guess quick caveat. Do you want the like short, medium, or long answer?
Let's go with the
medium.
Okay.
It's a medium.
Okay, so starting from a little bit of historical context, many large carnivores have been extirpated from a lot of their historical ranges by humans because we're not very good at sharing with them. And of course that includes wolves, and wolves maybe are some of the ones that have received the most attention. They're very charismatic. A lot of people like talking about wolves. So we have this sort of extirpation from many areas. But now, as our society is, I would say, becoming increasingly urbanized and sort of globalized in the extent that sort of even our industry is like moving elsewhere, our use of the land is often now becoming in ways that are much more compatible with large carnivores. And so we're seeing this sort of resurgence of large carnivores, both in North America and in Europe, sort of moving back into areas that they historically occupied that we are still occupying. And that's generated a lot of public debate, public interest. It's also generated a lot of research because scientists are trying to figure out, you know, what's going to happen, like what are the implications of this occurring. When it comes to wolves, a lot of that research has come out of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem because it's a great place to study wolves, and it was a national park, so they could really, you know, they had a lot of free reign in terms of being able to do long studies there. And one of the major narratives that has come out of that place and that research is this idea of a trophic cascade.
Oh, yes.
Where
first time on the podcast. Won't be the last time.
Won't be the last, probably. The concept there being that having large carnivores on the landscape has not only sort of direct effects, like they eat their prey, but that it can have a lot of indirect effects which continue to cascade outwards, to other species. And not only that this is a thing that happens, but that it's such a powerful thing that it's actually structuring that ecosystem. So that's kind of the like popular story that's come out of that. And it's the way it's presented in the popular media makes it seem a lot more certain than most people in the scientific community really feel it to be. But in either case,
it's cute. It's
there
a cute
is
little story.
It's so cute. It's like, so lovable. It's really feel good.
We'll save the flowers.
We'll save everything. Save the flowers, save the rivers, save the birds. All of the things are saved.
The Trophic Cascade Parade.
Exactly. Exactly. So whether or not that's true, it like bears further investigation.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that would be important to further investigate that is to look at this question in places that are not Yellowstone. One of the ways I think modern science has gotten a little bit weaker in its departure from natural history, I should say modern ecology, is that there is this strong desire to apply a finding from one place to all places,
Right.
which from the perspective of natural history doesn't make very much sense because you're very intimately acquainted with how different those two places actually are.
Yeah, it's something we talk about a lot.
Yeah, but from the perspective of like ecology and physics envy and all this stuff, people have this desire to,
Physics
find
envy,
these places.
yes.
Yeah.
It's real. Physics envy is
I
real.
know, you're dropping all these things that I love to hear.
So this whole question of wolves and like what is their impact on other species deserves study elsewhere besides Yellowstone, and that is being done. Europe, and particularly Scandinavia, has produced a lot of neat research about recolonizing wolf populations and what's going on there. The reason that Denali presents itself as a good place to potentially study this, and this Denali is where I work, is that this is not an instance of a recolonizing wolf population.
Mm-hmm.
This is just an instance of a wolf population that's just been chilling there the whole time, which is another problem, is that, there's good reasons to think that the way a system functions when it's changing like that, when you have just reintroduced this large carnivore and you're seeing all these effects, it's not necessarily safe to assume that that is how that system is going to work in 50 years or 100 years or 300 years, because it is this time of rapid change. Not that systems are stable to begin with, but we can't really extrapolate right from this 10-year period to say this is how it works. So lots of people studying wolves, right? That's the takeaway there. Lots of people studying wolves. Most of that study has been focused on how wolves are impacting prey species and maybe some sort of trickle-down cascades from there, which is understandable because that's a very dramatic interaction, right? Like predator and prey duking it out. National Geographic loves it. It's awesome. One thing that's only been more recently gaining some attention is this question of how do wolves impact other carnivores on the landscape? And because I really love carnivores, I was like, oh, studying that sounds perfect.
Yeah.
And the other sort of little quirk of Denali that makes it interesting and different than a place like Yellowstone is that, well, there's a lot of things that make it different, but one thing is that coyotes introduced themselves to Denali about 100 years ago. So as part of their phenomenal range expansion that they've undergone in North America, they have made their way up through Canada into Alaska and have established themselves in this place alongside a long-standing wolf population. And even that fact itself flies in the face of some of these ideas about like the effects that wolves are supposed to have.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it sort of provides us an opportunity to look at this question from like a different angle, a different perspective, rather than just sort of like the same old, same old. So in the biggest terms, what I'm interested in studying in Denali is you have a place where there are wolves on the landscape and have been for a long time. What does that mean for those smaller carnivores that share the landscape with them? In the case of Denali, you're talking about coyotes, red foxes, wolverines, lynx, and marten. Those are what's considered the mesocarnivores or mesopredators in that place. Then there's like also like smaller predators like ermines and like shrews and stuff. But for the purposes of my study, I was just kind of looking at the next step down. And there's two ways that I kind of went about trying to get information on this. One way was I'm curious to know what happens at carcass sites. One of the main ways that wolves are supposed to affect the animal communities around them is this fact that they're creating, by making regular kills, they're creating scavenging opportunities that can benefit other species.
Mm-hmm. That's
so I was
Trophic
interested.
Cascade, right?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in seeing, okay, we've studied that pretty exhaustively in Yellowstone. What does that look like in Denali? What different species use this resource? Does that use vary by any different environmental factors that I could identify? Is it maybe when it's colder or warmer, or if it's a carcass site that they feel safer at for some reason? Because I don't think it's safe to assume that there's some kind of sort of standard benefit. It's not like a tax thing where you can just take the regular deductible in terms of the benefit that carcass sites are providing to other scavengers. The other sort of approach that I'm taking and way of approaching this question is on a slightly broader spatial scale. So not just at the specific location of a carcass site, but speaking more generally, how are wolves and coyotes sharing this landscape, given that we have a belief that they don't like to share landscapes? Particularly wolves don't like to share with coyotes. So before I actually even began as a grad student, they had GPS collared 9 coyotes. And I have that collar data available to me. So we're talking like several locations for each coyote per day over a period of a couple years per coyote. And meanwhile, the park, as part of their management, monitors the wolf packs with GPS collars. So at least one wolf in every pack has a GPS collar. So by sort of combining these 2 data sets, I can start to ask some questions about what are the kind of habitat selections that these 2 species are doing. Can I identify any evidence that the habitat selection of coyotes is being influenced by what the wolves are doing?
Right.
And it's kind of a question of scale too, right? So let's say if you're a coyote, you don't want to get knocked off by a wolf. You kind of have 2 potential strategies that you might use. One is to just say, okay, I'm just not going to live where the wolves like to go, right? Like I'll just go somewhere else, like maybe up higher on the mountains or like in a thicker forest or something, and then I am way less likely to run into wolves. Another potential option would be to say, well, actually, I really like this habitat that the wolves also use, so I'm just going to be as alert as I possibly can, and if I like recognize that wolves are approaching and like being near me, I'll leave.
Yeah.
So my hope with the collar data is that I'll be able to start untangling some of that and see, does it look like their use patterns are pretty similar, which would indicate that the coyotes are avoiding the wolves at sort of that small scale, or are they quite different, which would indicate that the coyotes are basically just moving elsewhere so they don't have to encounter wolves. That was a lot. That was maybe the medium plus version. Sorry.
It was great. I loved it.
Yeah,
I learned a lot.
It's very interesting.
Brought up some old friends, some old enemies. What? Trophic cascades.
So, yeah, all right. Enough about trophic cascades. So, is there any evidence? Like, is there a suggestion of whether they're tending one way or the other right now?
For which part?
For coyotes, whether they're occupying the same spaces as wolves and just sort of ditching when the wolves come around, or whether they're seeking out sort of less desirable habitat.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I haven't really gotten very deep into that data set yet, so I can kind of only speak anecdotally from my experience on that landscape, which leads me to believe that it, as is typical with ecology, is probably a little bit of both. When they were collaring the coyotes, they were often finding them at higher elevations, kind of more up on some of the exposed mountainsides, whereas the wolves were more frequently sort of traveling in the valley bottoms. That's a little anecdotal. Maybe the coyotes were just easier to see up there.
Yeah.
One of the things that I did during my field work that I am actually not going to look at in terms of my master's analysis, but was data that I was collecting, was doing track surveys. And obviously, I don't know what kind of tracks there were in areas we didn't survey, and we didn't make a habit of surveying on the tops of mountains because they're difficult to get to. But we were seeing coyote tracks, right alongside wolf tracks. And in fact, the previous grad student kind of on this project from me did look at some of that track survey data and did find basically a spatial association between wolf tracks and the tracks of these other smaller carnivores, including coyotes, which would sort of indicate that there's probably not really consistent large-scale avoidance, or you wouldn't have seen that kind of association.
Yeah, you got to hunt where the hunting's good and live where the living's good.
Yeah. And I think particularly from what we know about coyote ecology and life history, although they are extremely adaptable, Denali is a pretty tough environment for them. And so I would suspect that the pressure of locating and obtaining food is probably going to be pretty significant, and something that if they're to survive, they're probably going to have to prioritize that over some kind of more nebulous big picture risk management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, coyotes, I almost think in the back of my head are like, they're almost commensal with humans in that they kind of, their range expansion, their habits, their ecology, kind of like it goes along with humans so much. And Denali is like, that's totally this weird oddball thing for me. I mean, this is the first time I've heard that they've been there.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
And that's just so cool. I mean, they're just such an adaptive species. What an amazing species.
Yeah. And it's, well, I think that their spread into rural Alaska has not been like super well documented because there's nobody out there to document a lot of it. Again, anecdotally, it does seem like, at least in terms of the way that they have moved into different areas, does seem to be associated with human development.
Okay, yeah.
Rather than just sort of like, hit the border and like, phew, just straight off into nowhere. There's, they're kind of moving along the human networks.
But they're able to get into these wilderness areas like Denali.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, so maybe the major mode of expansion might be human habitation, but they are able to get into these wilderness areas. Pretty cool. Even in the extreme north. Like Denali.
Yeah, and again, like establishing themselves where there is already a robust wolf population is pretty fascinating to me.
Super cool. Super cool.
Yeah. So there was an opening. There was some kind of an opening there for them to fill.
Yeah.
Or they nudged somebody else out, maybe.
Yeah, who knows? It's complicated. I mean, I think, not to get back to the Trophic Cascades, but there really is this want for us for things to be cute, for the ecology to do something nice and fluffy, like wolves are good, elk are good, like coyotes are bad. Like, we really want to like pigeonhole things. And then when we get a nice concept like Trophic Cascades, it's easy to like just be like, oh, that's awesome. That means that really
that explains everything.
My whole thing, like
that, and I just think we're so driven to be pattern seekers. Like, that's just such a part of our DNA and of how we think and see the world that like we're like too good, right? Like, we see patterns where maybe there aren't patterns.
Totally.
And or we see a pattern in one place and we just love patterns so much that we just start trying to jam everything else into the same pattern.
Everything's about Trophic
Enough
Cascades.
about the freaking Trophic Cascades. It's not a Trophic Cascade podcast.
I want it to be though. This idea sucks. Okay. Well, thank you. Okay, so thank you. Yeah, that was an awesome window into your world there and Denali and your research and the crazy kooky world of carnivores. Yeah, so
complex out there.
We don't have to take turns.
Okay.
I'm going to jump.
I guess if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just jump in a little bit. So you asked about the collar data, which, like I said, I haven't really gotten into as much, but I can tell you a little bit about what I've been seeing in the photo data, if that would be of interest.
Yeah.
Right. So to study these carcasses, I would go out, put up a trail camera, a motion sensitive camera, and then leave, come back months later. It'd be like Christmas, open up the camera, look at the pictures. And what I was seeing is that basically wolves and wolverines were scavenging at these sites a lot, regardless of whether it was, an old wolf kill or a winter kill or whatever. There would just be like wolves and wolverines all over it, at least comparatively to foxes and coyotes, which basically used the carcasses less by every metric. They showed up at less carcasses, they made less visits, they spent shorter amounts of time, and they were more vigilant during their visits. So the wolverines on average, they would spend something like maybe 10 or 15% of their time being vigilant. For foxes on the other end of the spectrum, it was like upwards of 50, I think it was somewhere around 60%. So, and the amount that wolves were scavenging was it didn't totally surprise me, but it is higher than what's been seen before and what's at least been recorded in the literature. I think like pretty much every wolf biologist I've talked to very readily will say like, oh yeah, wolves swing back by their old kill sites all the time. But nobody had really like actually quantified that or sort of come up with like, well, really how much time are they spending there? And the answer was a lot, which kind of changes the typical narrative. So usually when we think about scavenging ecology, the story has typically been you have some kind of top carnivore who makes the kill and then like exits stage left, clearing the way for the lucky scavengers. Mm-hmm. Whereas with wolves, they're basically the top carnivore and the top scavenger. So, if you're not a wolf, the perspective of spending a bunch of time at one of these carcass sites is kind of fraught with danger, given that the wolves are pretty likely to show up again.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I think.
But apparently, if you're a wolverine, you don't care about that. Because you're a wolverine.
Because you're a freaking wolverine.
Yeah.
Oh my god, that's awesome. Someday.
Oh, I thought you were going to say someday I'll be a wolverine.
Someday. I don't think I'll be a wolverine someday, but we can all, maybe for Halloween.
Well, maybe it might depend on your take on, biological reincarnation.
Yeah, exactly.
Someday your atoms will end up in a wolverine, so.
Yeah. Quick story. When I was a kid, I was like 5. I dressed up for Halloween as a wolf. And this wolf, it wasn't just any wolf, though. It was my imaginary friend that was a wolf.
Aha.
I just remembered this the other day. And it's super weird. I dressed up as my imaginary friend for Halloween.
Okay. I have a matching story for
All right,
that.
go for it.
So, circling back to the topic of maybe like things that were influential in making me a naturalist. Between the ages of like 4 and about 6.5, I think I spent at least 50% of my time as a red fox.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Yes.
I don't even know where to start. I had a name. It was Shadow Thief.
Nice. I remember mine's name. I think it was Boring.
I would, crawl around in the woods dressed in red. At dinner time, I would pretend that my cranberry juice was blood and like lap it up out of my glass.
Yes. I love that.
And like, God bless my parents for not squashing this out of me.
That's so cool.
They let it run for some years.
It's all coming out now.
They just let it roll. And I like, this is very hand wavy, but I do actually kind of think that maybe spending a lot of time as a kid trying to be in the mind space of another animal just made me even more into that than I was before.
Oh, we're all about the hand wavy.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree, though. I can't remember mine's name, though. I think it was something boring, though, like George or something.
Shadow Thief.
George the Wolf. Yeah, Shadow Thief is way cooler.
I remember my kindergarten teacher, like, early on in kindergarten, we did an art project where we were supposed to do draw something with watercolors, and I drew a fox bringing a dead rabbit home to its babies. And so there was like the blobby red fox and then like this rabbit and then like blood everywhere and like little foxes. And the kindergarten teacher was like, sent this note home like, I don't even remember exactly what it was, but just something to the effect of like, I didn't tell your child to do this. Like, please don't blame me for this.
It's like they sat down with their lawyer and they were like, okay, how do I get out of this one?
Yeah.
That's so awesome. Love it. So we wanted to ask you about the question that we had phrased was, what extracurricular curiosities are you psyched about right now? So
I liked the wording of that, by the way.
It's all this guy, Stefan, right here.
Nice.
He's the writer. And yeah, so like naturalists, something that we've learned by observing naturalists is that naturalists kind of like, they don't have an off switch usually. There's not. It usually just kind of keeps going and going.
Yeah.
And so, naturalists tend to have some kind of little pet project or observation or thing going on at any given time. So I figured we'd ask you.
Boy, well, grad school is a little bit all-consuming, so I haven't had as much energy as I might have liked to develop that kind of life balance. Being in Seattle has given me a lot of opportunities to people watch. And I wouldn't say that I have a coherent project around that, but I think one thing that I have been trying to be more conscious of is my own internal dialogue as I'm people watching, partly precipitated by kind of this national conversation around race and privilege and class and all this stuff. So, like I'm at this university, it's got 60,000 students from a huge variety of social and ethnic backgrounds. I'm also a TA for the first time. And so I've been trying to pay more attention to, as I'm watching people walk around, like you're saying, I can't turn off the observation. So I'm always like noticing stuff about them. But then I'm trying to pay more attention to like Am I drawing conclusions from that? Am I making assumptions? Yeah, I've noticed a lot more than I would have maybe predicted going in, which gives me further incentive to like keep working on it.
We're also curious what naturalists, famous or otherwise, have inspired you.
Oh gosh. So when I saw this question, I was like quaking a little bit in my slippers because there's so many.
Yeah.
And like I think some of them have probably, like, I can't even necessarily remember names anymore, but just like I know at the time, you know, learning about this person and their life was really inspiring to me. I mean, I think many of sort of the classics, particularly people in the wildlife sciences, who I think were also excellent naturalists, people like Jane Goodall, and I sort of doubly respect her for not only exercising good naturalist abilities, but having to fight a lot of like societal bullshit to bring that information out. Mm-hmm. I also really, I don't know that this is maybe quite the direct answer to this question, but I think, you know, different cultures have a lot to offer in terms of teachings on how to be an effective naturalist. And that's something that I've really enjoyed learning about and trying to pick up on is, just studying other ways of doing things and being like, oh, wow, like, look at how they incorporated this into whatever it is, into the way they build things or into the way they tell stories or, you know, whatever that might be. Mm-hmm. And to me, in some ways, that framework of approaching it, what am I trying to say here? Like, if I look at the life of like one person, that can be really inspiring, and I can maybe identify things that they did that I would also like to do. But there's always sort of this feeling of like, well, that was this one person's like particular life. And since I don't have the ability to do exactly the same things they did, like I might still feel a little bit in the dark as to like, well, how do I do that? How do I approach these things? But I think learning about those in a slightly broader cultural context can make me feel like I have a little bit more tools to sort of say, okay, like if that's the way this society went about integrating this practice, maybe that's something I could do too, even though this is a very different context. That being said, it's really, you have to be really aware of issues of cultural appropriation there, in the sense that, you know, you can't say, oh, this society used this particular ceremony, so I'm just going to mimic that ceremony, because, like, that's dumb and not going to work.
Unoriginal as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's been lovely.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's been an awesome first interview. We'll have to have you on again soon.
I would like that.
Yeah, be cool. You could be a reoccurring member of this team.
There's three corners in the Triforce.
Ooh,
there you go. Or I could just be the person who like randomly pops in from the side and is like, Trophic cascades.
You just have to come in and mention Matt's trigger words.
It's totally a trigger word. I will go
then log off.
Oh my god. So funny.
Stir the pot a little bit.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.